So who's going to go first?
So I'll start first. So I'm Nancy Wilson, and I'm here to maybe set the tone about the perspective of what the United States school system looks like, and to be able to speak more locally from New York State and the Long Island region. So when we start thinking about the United States school system, one of the core essence or topics that we need to focus on is that all individuals within the United States are entitled what's called FAPE, but free appropriate public education. And I don't assume that anyone knows that, because often there will be a predetermined frame of reference or understanding as to what education looks like, depending on what that was like for you, your families, your history. But anyone who arrives to the United States has an opportunity to attend public schools at no cost to the family. With that in mind, we know that in the United States as well, there are underlying federal regulations that are defined for us as a state entity. The feds provide a basic floor of understanding, floor of principle, and resources of which states then have to at least meet, or they supersede or exceed with higher expectations and standards to be employed and put in place. So in New York State, from which I can speak mostly from, my role has been that of, an educator, an individual that has taught special education, provided coaching, eventually became a special education administrator, primarily in that of the Huntington schools, and most recently became the executive director for the Division of Special Education for Western Suffolk BOCES, where we oversee services for 18 component districts, as well as a specific targeted group of students that we have. One of the pieces that I find as an administrator is when parents come to us, I'd like to state that first and foremost, educators are partners in the process. How many of you are parents here participating in a parental role? How many in an advocacy role of some sort? Lawyer, advocate, okay? And how many individuals as an educator? Okay. A few in there. And then there must be some others where you don't wish to share. At the end of the day, when we go into the educational system and we are looking to support children, we go in because we want children to be successful. We want to understand how to help and support them. We don't go in saying, how do we damage? How do we look at pulling away resources? How do we disengage from the process? So educators and the school system, I would like to stress, are partners in the process for supporting students. That's why we went to school. That's why we dedicate our lives 24/7 working towards that passion. So with that in mind, when you are an educator, you're an advocate, you're a parent, everyone is on that same page working to support the child. So I just mentioned in there, it's an interdisciplinary team approach, which means parents have vital input, and that's recognized under federal law and state law. No individual can act on behalf of a child without parental input, feedback, and consent. And that goes to the extreme when you're talking about 504 or CSE IEPs, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Also, when we talk about partners in the process, not just the parent, but the educational system, we want to invite in meaningful participation and input with outside providers. So for many of you who have a child with a specific disability, whether it's a DSM-5 diagnosis, mental health, social, emotional, medical, whatever that might be, you're working with outside individuals that meet some kind of medical recognition. We never claim from an educational standpoint side to be medical experts, so often we will ask you to share for or provide consent so that we can engage in collaborative problem solving for the best interest of the child. So common goals, partnership, collaboration, with parental permission, we engage in conversations there. In the school system, in particular in the United States, there are typically 3 tiers of support that are provided to individuals for the learning process. And it starts with the least restrictive environment, which sometimes you'll hear the acronym LRE. So when we talk about least restrictive environment, your first line when you're working with a public school, I'm not going to speak to private entities because they're not governed by the same laws and regulations. I'll only speak to the public system and New York State approved private schools. When you talk about the least restrictive environment, you're talking about the general education setting or the homeschool as much as possible in your public setting. In least restrictive environment, there is a mechanism called response to intervention, RTI, where students do not need to be identified or labeled for any means in order to get beginning levels of support and service. So I just throw that out there because that's relatively new. You know, the past 5 or 6 years, it's evolved. It looks a little different. But the intent there is that individuals come together, again, interdisciplinary teams, collaborating, problem solving on behalf of the child to look at supports and interventions that can be provided prior to any type of labeling. And that can involve support from a medical standpoint side, nursing services. It could be occupational therapists, physical therapists, special education teachers, general ed teachers, reading specialists, math, etc. That's the interdisciplinary team. The critical components there that are outlined on the sheet, and this is just a bulleted sheet, in no way, shape, or form was it meant to be comprehensive in nature, but the fundamental elements there is that it's data-driven. There's ongoing progress monitoring. So what does research tell us? That a good practice is to put intervention strategies in place and allow 6 to 8 weeks to see whether or not that intervention is making a change, whether an individual is deriving meaningful benefit in an effort to help them access and close a gap, all right? If a child's not responding, sometimes you might look at the next 2 levels or tiers, and those 2 tiers function differently, but they are provided for on the federal level and then further developed on the state level. So when you talk about 504, have individuals heard of 504 and 504 accommodation plans? Okay, that came out of the American with Disabilities Education Act back in 1973, actually before special education even evolved. And it was basically to prevent any form of discrimination for an individual that had some type of limitation or impairment or disability. When we talk about Section 504 within the educational setting, you'll hear the conversation go about what is the disability, okay? Both 504 and IDEA, CSE services, individuals with disability services, they are protected under confidentiality. So when the teams are meeting, this information is not disseminated or shared with any individuals outside of those directly working with the child or helping to create the plan to support an individual child, okay? So in 504, there needs to be a recognized disability. That's the first prong, if you will, on that. Just because an individual, almost every child that has a diagnosis, especially under DSM-5, anytime they come with one, they may be an individual eligible for 504, most likely are, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're entitled to a 504 plan, accommodation plan. Whether or not an individual warrants a 504 accommodation plan really comes out of looking at what is the substantial limitation to a major life activity. And those are defined here, and it's been recently updated in the past 2 years to include learning and such aspects such as reading. So in the past they would say it was breathing. You know, it was basically levels or forms of survival that would go on. But you'll see in here, it does break it down further even to some social, emotional management, attention, vitality aspects, okay, that fall under that. If someone qualifies for a 504 accommodation plan, and I know the kind gentlemen on either side have some examples and we'll speak to that a little bit, but when you get to that plan, it's about accommodating. And there's a difference between accommodating and modifying, and I know we're going to touch on that, and I don't want to overstep or you know, be disrespectful in any means, but I'll just glean out a simple, you know, change for you. When you talk about accommodations, you're talking about adjusting or providing a measure of support to an individual that is not altering the curriculum or the instruction that is taking place. So for example, like some people will say mitigating factors, like if you happen to wear glasses, it helps you see. It's not that you can't see. Thank you. It's not that you cannot see, but with glasses, it enables your acuity to be more refined. Same thing if an individual has access to a wheelchair and can move about. That's an accommodation. You need to provide for those. Whereas a modification is a change to either the environmental structure, to the curriculum, or adapting of that sort. So 504 plans are how do you surround those accommodations in order to help an individual access and participate in their environment. And that can carry over into college, okay? It actually carries over into the world of work potentially. The third type of support in the U.S. educational system for individuals that have unique challenges really falls under the Disabilities with Education Act, or IDEIA, the Improvement Act. And that's where we talk about the Committee on Special Education, and we talk about specially designed instruction. It's actually more intensive. It's a more involved programmatic plan. Within that plan, though, you need to know that either 504 or the IEP CSE document, they're legal documents. They're bound to be followed in the way in which they're written, and they are updated on an annual basis. So they evolve with the child. One of the other pieces that is important to remember is just because my child might have X disorder, your child has the same disorder, your child has the same disorder, we don't look the same. Everyone is truly an individual. There may be common characteristics, there may be common elements, but we're not the same. Everyone's an individual as a human being. So those rights and protections are there, and whenever these are being devised, you can have underlying tenets that are similar, but they don't necessarily drive the individual interventions because they're individualized. So I just want to make that clear. And I'll just sum up and then I'll be able to answer further questions. The IEP process has more extensive evaluations that need to take place before an individual is determined to be eligible with a disability, okay? And as families or providers, you need to know that the districts have an obligation to do those evaluations, but parents also need to make the child available for those evaluations in order for eligibility to be determined. A medical doctor's note doesn't make that happen. An outside OT eval doesn't make it happen. It's got to be interdisciplinary, which means student's teacher, observations of the child, parental input, doctor's input, etc. in there. And then you'll just notice in that little summary sheet, there are 3 prongs that determine, so an individual must have a disability and what parents are most uncomfortable with. In New York State, most states recognize 13 disability categories. There are 2 states that only recognize 2. They kind of put everything under an other category, and then they look at specific learning disabilities separate. But in New York State, there are 13 disability categories. Whether you like them or not, whether I like them or not as an executive director does not matter. They are what they are, okay? So an individual, for example, with autism, whether your child you want to consider as high functioning with Asperger's, or you're talking about someone with a more significant level, it's one label that they give. Same thing, other health impairment, that's what a lot of individuals with the profile might fall under here, because you're talking about limited strength, vitality, and heightened alertness. The other element they would have to meet is requiring specially designed instruction, where you would be talking about altering the content, methodology, or delivery of the instruction that's provided, and that would drive the IEP services.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Perfect timing.
Thanks to our lovely soul in the front.
Now we go on to Brian. Well, David, David's going to speak next.
I've never used one, so which way do I click?
Just forward, yeah.
The one.
I think so.
Okay. Well, I feel in some ways I've been preparing for this talk my whole life. So for the last 33 years, I've been a teacher of the visually impaired and orientation mobility instructor. So I work with kids with visual impairments. So the irony isn't lost on me that the first symptom my son has was a vision problem. He developed photophobia. And I remember talking with the ophthalmologist he's going, can you believe your son has this? And I was like, no, I can't. So my job teaching is a little different than other teachers in that I follow my students a long time because I work for a district. I stay with the students. I'm not usually throughout the rest of the state. Districts will contract out through BOCES where you'll share teachers in a district. So I worked for BOCES for 5 years. You never knew where you were going to be. You changed students frequently. Since I've been in South Country for the last 29 years, I followed 10 students. I walked them in the door when they came in kindergarten, and I walked them out when they graduated or aged out at age 21, and I had another 15 that I saw for over 10 years. So I've seen the full power of the 504 and the IEP process. It's a terrific, terrific tool. I've seen, what it can do when a child's in kindergarten all the way up through when they're in high school. I've worked with children with multiple disabilities, and I followed them all the way through. And the 504 and the IEP are powerful, they're nimble, they're quick, they can change, they can adapt to the students' changing circumstances, and I think with our population, that's what happens. All of a sudden, you learn to deal with one thing, and then all of a sudden, the next day, suddenly you can have a whole different array of problems and concerns. One of the things that's been very, very interesting too in working in, I think I've worked in 75 different schools over the years, is the differences between school districts, how they interpret the basic law that Nancy talked about, and even within districts, from the elementary school to the middle school, depending on which school psychology or which case manager you have, the way they view the law, interpret the law, you would think it would kind of be uniform in districts. It's not. So you can have the law, it's written, it seems straightforward, but the way districts choose to interpret it from district to district, from building to building, changes quite a bit. I've been in some districts that you sit down to the CSC and you feel like the chair has a stopwatch that they started as soon as you start talking, and it's like, oh, look at this one only took 3 minutes. My district, as a contrast, we'll go through the IEP, every single page of the IEP. They'll explain the parents' rights before the meeting. They'll let the parent know that if you have a question about something, you can, and you do not, want to continue the meeting, you can defer the meeting. You can come back to it. You don't have to agree to something. If you want a parent advocate with you, you can have a parent advocate with you at the meeting. Other districts, they are not so good at informing parents of their rights, and I've seen parents get steamrolled in meetings. So it's very, very important that you know the law. You know the law for your individual state. I'll speak to a few things in New York state law as we go through some of this, but it's really, really important that you know your rights, you know what your state law is, so that you can come and you can talk to the committee. Like Nancy, one of the things she mentioned is least restrictive environment. I had a one-on-one aide who said, I'm going, before committee. I want my son, he's fully, he's in all inclusion classes, but I'd like him to be mainstreamed in something. And I said, mention least restrictive environment. If he's in his regular gen ed class and not an inclusion class, that's least restrictive. That's more the norm than putting a restriction on him. And she went in, she mentioned that, and she said, she came out of the meeting, she said they thanked her for being such an informed parent about the law. So it really does pay. Know what your state's law, know what your rights are, and generally, if you have a reasonable accommodation that you're asking for, and you can relate it to your child's needs with APS, most districts are very, very accommodating. I had one of the things with summer services is there's phrasing about if a child demonstrates significant regression, they need summer services. So this one mom is saying, that I need my son to have a longer summer school day, and I said, you need to mention he will, have significant regression. She went into the meeting, and she said, afterwards she told me, well, I didn't get it. I said, what did you say? She said, well, I said I need my, my child to go because I work. As soon as they heard that, they denied it. So you need to know the language. You need to use the language. Okay. So we'll start here. We have Brian was able to get for us some 504s, 3 504s from APS students, and I'll show you how they're a little bit different, and then I'll show you an IEP and show you how that's a little bit different. The first one has a medical diagnosis of autoimmune disease, Addison's disease, hypoparathyroidism. This is a 15-year-old 10th grader. So the students are all different ages and all different at all different areas along the curriculum. So all they have is benefit from frequent breaks, which is a common thing, access to restroom, flexibility for deadlines and assignments. Sorry, next one, right? Limited physical activity and physical education class, extra time during passing time, and a copy of class notes when available. And I thought that was very interesting that they said when available. Generally, if you have a copy of the class notes, it's the teacher's responsibility to get notes for the student. This when available, it's like, well, what does that mean? So if they're really never available, that's okay because they weren't available. So that's one of the things. If it benefits your child to have a copy of the class notes, and we'll go over the range of accommodations and modifications you can have. We'll touch on them briefly, but we'll give you, you have a packet so you can kind of see what they are. So for your individual child, as we go through these, you can kind of see what are the things that would benefit your child. And again, it's not to give your child an advantage, it's to create a level playing field. If you're changing the playing field, it's a modification. If you're leveling it, it's an accommodation. Okay, and they tell you who's at the meeting: mother, history teacher, chem teacher, English teacher. So a few of the staff members. Okay, moving on. Our next student is a 6th grader, age 11, and it gives a more full description of what's going on with the child. Mentions medications the child's on, mentions photophobia. And as you look through this, 504, you see that's one of the light sensitivity is one of the problems that is most difficult for this child. So they have use of a visor. They also have a teacher of the visually impaired as a consultant. And it, a little bit further down, mentions the diagnosis of APS type 1. It also mentions ADHD. So there's some of the curriculum accommodations rather, are there for the ADHD, and some of them are for the APS. It does mention that the child tends to be tardy and absent, and that's, we found with our child as he got older, that seems to be one of the overriding concerns. What do you do about a lot of absences? Or when your child's late to school a lot because of doctor visits or blood work or things like that. Okay, so we can see I would say the top 4 accommodations all have to do with APS, and the last, or the top 3 have to do with the APS, and the last 4 may be more ADHD than the APS. But you can see there's a variety of accommodations, and it talks about what they are, what the frequency, duration of them. There's color overlays to make the work less glaring and to make it easier for the student to see. And then additionally, you have testing accommodations of extended time. Sorry, am I there? Good. Extended time, breaks, use of adaptive equipment, and tests administered with minimal distractions. Okay? Our next 504 is a 17-year-old in 11th grade. So this happens to be my son. So you can see there's a full description: adrenal insufficiency, and then there's a list of things that the school needs to be aware of. If there's a broken bone, if there's vomiting, fever, things we heard about today. So those are spelled out. I think it's very, very important that the medical piece of information be shared with the school. As a vision teacher, the first thing I do is I ask for the ophthalmological report. And then if there's any associated medical conditions, I usually ask for a release of information from the parents so that we have a full understanding of what part of this is medical and what part of this is educational. I think the worst thing that parents can, or a school can do, is try to remediate something educationally that's a medical problem. For example, I'll give you an example of this. I had a student who had bilateral ptosis, which is droopy eyelids. So we can do all kinds of accommodations, or the child could have surgery to lift his eyelids, and then he's fine. So rather than try to jump through hoops and do all these things, there's a medical piece that needs to be addressed. And a lot of times we want to make sure that the school understands what the medical piece is so that then they can put a proper educational plan in place. You can see below additional time to complete assignments. Am I on the right slide? Yep, at the bottom, additional time to complete assignments. Transportation is notified. The reason transportation is notified is that we can provide an air-conditioned bus. Okay, and there's another one on the bottom, preferential seating, restrict contact with possibly ill students. So that's something you're not going to see on a general list of accommodations for students, but that's something important with our population, especially in the elementary school when kids are given assigned seating, they're sitting next to close to kids. It's important to make the elementary school teacher realize you have to, try to keep our child away from sick children. Okay. On the next slide, there we go. We have air conditioned is important. And the part that I think is real important on this one is the amount of absences. That Matthew's 504 has that after 10 days of cumulative absences. Now, usually it's consecutive absences that the school will start to trigger some kind of help for the student. With Matthew, anytime he has 10 days, doesn't have to be consecutive, he'll get an hour of tutoring per week per subject. So he's a high academic student, so in order to help him keep up with his classes, every 10 days of absences, and the school district even said if it's a partial day of absence. So usually most districts' policy is 10 consecutive days. They have to be consecutive. Then you're entitled. With Matthew, it can be non-consecutive. It can be partial days. And then he gets this level of tutoring. So again, one district may say, no, we're going to stick to the 10. But districts generally, if you can make the argument, they'll be flexible in what they can do. Okay, this page toward the middle, it gives you a more complete description of things that are going on. Okay, and then, let's see, we also have access to food and water for Sjogren's type syndrome. So that's in class and even during testing. Okay, our next student is a third grade, age 8, who has an IEP. So the IEP is going to be much more complete than the 504. You'll see going into it, the child has 3 goals. Now, this is a student I'm going to summarize as is a homebound student, doesn't attend school. The school district, not in this state, provides 3 hours of educational service a week. And if you look through that IEP, you look through it on your own, you'll see that they say, oh, the child, this doesn't impact the student at all. The child's functioning fine. They have 3 goals. I'll just look at the first one. The student will answer grade level comprehension questions with 85% accuracy in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Goals are supposed to be measurable, they're observable, and I think there's only 3 goals for a student who's not going to school at all, who's only getting 3 hours of education a week. To me, this is a really, really, really thin IEP. I understand, why they did the goals the way they did, because there's only 3 of them. They made them extremely generalized. There's not a lot of meat here. There's not a lot of substance. I kind of ran it by Nancy, and Nancy agrees with me. So, and I know Brian's mentioned that the parent is dissatisfied with the services they're receiving. This is now to pay state parent. I'd want to know, in New York State, if you are a homebound student on the elementary level, the minimum is 5 hours a week of direct service, and then once you go into the secondary level, it's 10 hours a week minimum. Those are the minimums. So 3 hours as an elementary school student seems really, really thin. But again, it depends on the state, and that may be something you have to really, really fight for. So we'll skip through a little bit now.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So, SMART IEP goals. You want specific measurable, you can look at that. And then we have a list of all different accommodations that you have over the next couple pages. All right, so these are all testing accommodations. If Brian has a little time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about extended time, okay? But I'll turn it over to Brian now.
Okay. You're good. So we're going to start with the common classroom modifications and there. So Nancy hit on this earlier. So it's just a quote we found that accommodations level the playing field while modifications change the field that you're playing on. So as you go through this, just the main thing that I think we came up with is, as a parent, I'm a parent and an educator, I'm a high school science teacher. The best thing that you can do is just be the best advocate for your family, for your child, or whoever has the APIS ed. So as we go through this, just keep that in mind, that you are your parent's best advocate in these situations. So some common classroom goals here is We're looking at having other students share classroom notes with a teacher. I think there's a pointer. Yeah, so this one right here, that really should be the responsibility of the teacher. Again, this is in New York State. Most of this is geared towards New York State. But that should really be the responsibility of the teacher. If it's on a 504 IEP, you shouldn't have to go to another student and say, hey, I missed yesterday's class. Can you give me the notes? If it's on a 504 IEP, that should be provided for you, and that should be the teacher's responsibility. Okay, so we're gonna go to this one here, use of a word processor. This one's pretty important, especially if your child can type. That's probably one of the best goals that you should try to get on an IEP if it's appropriate for your child, is to get that use of a word processor.
And there's a lot of software out there today that can help facilitate that.
Yeah.
Districts will actually purchase those.
So Nancy, I don't know if you heard what Nancy just said, but you want to?
I didn't want to.
No, you're fine, go ahead.
Districts will, when identified with these particular targeted needs, there are a lot of technological advances out there. There are a lot of programs that are available to students. So when particular individuals have these unique and specific needs, districts will look into what the research base is behind it, match it up by experts, whether it's a vision therapist, an OT, whomever it might be, and they actually purchase the items for school use. Even if you're utilizing some materials in the school setting, there can be an agreement to also have it go between school and home.
Thanks. So we're going to hit up on this top one here. Take more time to take tests, to complete tasks or a test. That should only be utilized if the content has been mastered by the student. We all know, like, we get tons of math homework because it's repetitive and you need to build a skill to go on to the next step of math. You shouldn't get extra time for that though if you haven't, or to complete the task if you haven't mastered that skill yet, okay?
I'm sorry. You have to be very careful with that, with taking more time, because what happens is you run out of time in the day. If you start to back things up, the next thing you know, now you're missing class time generally or frequently in order to take the time to take a test. So you start to miss curriculum content, and the next thing you know, you're a week behind, 2 weeks behind. It's very easy for that to steamroll. So you have to be very careful that you don't give tons and tons of time, because it's just not going to work.
That kind of hits more on an elementary level too, where your student might be in the same class all day long and the class might transition to science and you're still taking a math test. If you can, try to find another time to finish that so you're not missing content in the other subjects. In high school we have like study halls and stuff, so we would have the student come in at that point to finish a test so they're not missing transitions to the other classrooms. And that goes along with this one with the homework. Like I was saying, just make sure that the concept is understood by your son or daughter before you start to, I don't know, like chunk it, I guess I could say.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So when teams are looking at accommodations, it's really, here's the analogy that you can think about. If a child is unable to read, but yet you're giving them a test to assess their reading ability, they should not have it read. However, if conceptually and comprehension-wise an individual has that skill set and you're measuring their knowledge base, but their reading interferes with their ability, it would be acceptable to have that accommodation of having a test read. Same thing when it comes to homework assignments or extended time. If it's a teacher-made test, instead of giving 10 problems, you might give 5, so that fatigue, time, expediting is still happening. You could still assess an individual child's knowledge or mastery of that skill. So chunking, providing breaks, shorter but more frequent assignments may be an acceptable alternative to still assess skill sets and help them learn so that they're not missing critical social opportunities and instructional time.
Thank you. Okay, and then we sit down, we put a list together of the do's and don'ts of a meeting. As I've stated before, and we've talked about, the most important thing is that make sure you participate in your child's meeting. You are the advocate. My wife and I feel like we almost understand this disease more than some of the doctors we go to. So I can only imagine what happens in a school district when you go to these meetings and you say EPS 1 and they're like, I don't even know what that is, and they respond to you. So just make sure you're participating in the meetings. That's the biggest thing that we can say to do. Nancy has mentioned this before. You are just as valuable to the meeting as the CSE chair and as the other teachers that are involved. Jennifer Orange said this earlier, say there are no silly questions. As professionals, we understand a lot of this stuff. As parents, you might not. Don't be afraid to ask. Our job is to educate, so there is no such thing as a silly question. And if you don't understand something, ask. Keep asking. You've heard some things like least restrictive environment, LRE, IDEA. We throw around acronyms like we have probably hundreds of them, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that you ask if you don't understand what an acronym is. When you're in a meeting and they're throwing letters at you, pause, stop it, and say, I don't know what that acronym, go ahead.
And I would say too, there is nothing wrong with asking for team meetings or to meet with smaller groups of people. I love when my families are open and honest and transparent because that's what I believe in. Can we meet? I'm a little nervous because when you're sitting around a table that could have 12 individuals all reporting out, that can be very intimidating. So if you want, even prior, not that a determination can be made at that pre-meeting or team meeting, but ask to meet with individuals separately, have a conversation, write down your questions the middle of the night, keep the notebook so you don't lose track of them. Come with those questions. We love that as educators because as partners in the process, if we work together, we know the outcomes are going to be more meaningful. We have everything to gain. Think about it. There's state accountability from a district's end for state reporting purposes and funding streams. If a child is successful and they're making gains and they're happy and they're going to continue to finish their school career, that reflects positively. So team meetings and ongoing communication and collaboration is vital. We love it. Ask for it.
100% agree. Nancy hit on this, and Dave kind of hit on this too. Make sure you understand the regulations that govern the services and accommodations of your child. This keeps everybody accountable. If you come in and you're not informed, and the CSE chair might just be starting the time like Dave said, and okay, 5 minutes up, let's go. You might not get the services that your child might need. So make sure before you go into a meeting that you've read up on your state's regulations and understand what the process is going to be when you go into that meeting. This one's pretty important. We hit on, we talked about, make sure you realize that this service is not a permanent placement, that this service should be reviewed annually. So you should be having a meeting every year to see, maybe set new goals, see what the goals are, what the next progression is.
And a meeting can be called by a parent, by a staff member. You don't need to wait for it to happen. You could say, I'm interested. You just have to give a reasonable period of time for mutually agreeable schedules in order to arrange for them. But that's not months on end. That's, in New York State, you're required 5 days notice. But, that's something where you have the right to ask for a meeting.
And the next point just says it's reviewed annually. So make sure that happens, that you're on top of that. As we said before, I think we're the best advocates for our child. We understand the EPS 1 and what it's about. And I'm sure we all first got that first diagnosis and Google became our best friend that night. So same thing in these meetings. You are the best person in regards to your son or daughter's disability. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to talk in there. I'll tell you a quick story. One time, our first meeting we went into, we had one of those that were like, you got 5 minutes to talk. And as an educator, I was so frustrated with the process that I walked out and told my wife, I said, if I was an educator, they would have just steamrolled me. Like I was just flabbergasted on what transpired in that meeting. My daughter had raised some of her scores, but she was still failing, and they wanted to take all her services away because she met part of that RTI process. I said, I don't care that she raised her grades, she's still failing. And we literally had to fight for a half hour there to say, I'm happy that she raised her grades, but she's still failing. And we had to fight for that service. And I said, had I not been an educator, we would have walked out of there saying, okay, good job, you know? So make sure you're informed and aware of what's going on. And make sure you celebrate any little minor thing that your child accomplishes, especially ours, because they are special people and all those accomplishments need to be celebrated. I'm just going to skip through these quick because they got a 5-minute warning 4 minutes ago.
You have 3 minutes.
Oh, I have 3? Okay, I'll go back a couple.
Yeah.
I want to get to this one. Build a connection with your teacher, with the CSE chair. Don't be that person that comes in and this is what I want and this is how it's going to happen. Be part of the process. Be forthcoming. Be an advocate, but don't be overbearing in the process. We are professionals. We have gotten degrees in this stuff, and we are out to help your child out to be successful.
I think if you keep in mind that people are trying to work towards, you know, the same goal, the child's the most important piece. When I do a CSE, it doesn't matter the parent, the teachers, anyone else, it's about the child. I can say when lawyers get involved, though, then everyone's playing on that legal field, and that does not allow for the same flexibility. Just be mindful of that. Meaning, if a parent and we engage in a collaborative and collegial relationship, even if we don't have the extensive knowledge, but we're working hard to get that knowledge and the parent is working with us, we can figure things out and try to make it work. But when lawyers come in trying to demand things, I'll just say, then a district is going to go into a total legal mode with their lawyers, and then you get probably less, to be honest, because now it's, you can't even have open collegial dialogues because everything you say potentially has an implication for due process, arguments, and fighting. It's kind of like working to play nice in the sandbox to a certain degree. So, you know, again, educators did not go to school to say, how can we screw up children? We went because we care and we want them to be successful, and our job is to get those positive outcomes. We don't know everything, but we know a lot. We are a piece of the puzzle, just like the parents are, just like the fellow educators are. My related service staff know they have a voice as well and should speak up to their expertise. Outside doctors as well. You want to do that. If you feel after you've put forth your best effort, you're not getting your needs met, then maybe you have to pursue that. I can't speak for every district, but I'm just saying, if someone walks through the door and it's contentious from the beginning and there are lawyers involved, I'm not afraid of lawyers. You know, my brother's one. But not afraid of them, but it's not going to shift. But I will tell you that some of the conversations will change. I don't know if you could speak to that for your district.
Yeah, absolutely.
It doesn't help. So
I guess the best way to come in is come in with a stern smile and just be able to work, okay? Because you might be told no, smile and say, ask why, present evidence to your case. Like Dave was saying, the best thing you can do is have that evidence to support your case, because they really can't turn you down at that point.
One of the things I want to say, Brian mentioned, you know, knowing your teacher. What we do on Matt's, I went through it too fast, on his 504, we ask for a meeting, usually as soon as possible in the beginning of the year. If we can manage it during the first week of school, we do. We have a list of bulleted points that explain the different aspects that Matt has of APS, and we, you know, mention the educational implications of them, because we're aware during the first week of school and first 2 weeks of school, everybody, all the teachers are overwhelmed with everything else they have to do. So you want to have something in writing. I had one student whose parent had a whole portfolio on this student, a picture of the child. The child happened to have achromatopsia, which is no color vision, and she had pictures to show this is what crayons look like with my daughter. You know, she really had a very nice folder for each teacher that explained the specifics and gave them in layman's terms ways that they could understand, so that the teacher, you know, because they can't absorb everything because they have so many meetings at the beginning of the year, at least have something to walk away from that later on they can go, okay, let me take a look at this and maybe get it to stick. So to have something prepared that you can give the teacher and realize, you know, I know everything's going on at the beginning of the year. And the other thing is we have a nurse. We always have the school nurse at meetings, because the nurse can be you know, one of your best friends. They can be the one who is that person to be able to translate, because the teachers can hear it and they don't realize how serious it is. The nurse is your best chance of really having somebody understand the seriousness and ramifications of APS type 1.
Brian, have you said everything you want to say?
Yes, go ahead. Yep.
So we have a few minutes left, about 12 minutes for questions. So, yes ma'am, just identify yourself and then
My name is Susan.
and who are you addressing the question to?
Where's our mic runner?
I'm not sure whoever can answer
All right.
that.
Oh, wait, hold on. So we have a mic coming your way. So, yeah, just indicate to the mic runner if you have a question, and Malcolm, you can just wait to see. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify with APS
Is it on?
1 because it's,
Yeah, it's not on.
We're working out after all that. There you go. Go ahead. Yep.
okay, with APS 1, can you hear me? Versus something that's more like psychological, like, like you mentioned, Asperger's or something. Do we need a doctor's report? Or is it just our own information of what we think we need based on what we know about the condition? Or conditions like diabetes and all this?
So in order to fulfill the requirements from an educational standpoint side, what's asked of the educational entity, a doctor's note with a diagnosis is a starting point. But then defining from there would be your voice or individuals as to, these are the characteristics, this is how my child presents with, this is what I find I need to do at home when we're working on homework together or when we're out at this location, this is what it looks like. And then that helps the team to further understand how something is affecting the whole child from a global standpoint, not just educational, you know. So the doctor's note kind of opens that door for the discussion and documentation, but the rest of it is really about now what is specific to the child.
Okay, good. Because I have a friend who has a child with, like, what you said, Asperger's, and she had to go through, like, days of studies just to bring to the school to get a special thing. So we don't have to deal with that.
No, and I think, with Asperger's or autism, it's a spectrum disorder, and there are a lot of layers within that, and it carries, their services are kind of very different and unique, so that's why it might have been more extensive.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Does anyone have any questions about
We have one.
college? We're here to answer questions about APS for college.
I wanted to know, is there a specific number of meetings that you can have within a year? Because sometimes with this disorder, like my son last year, he got multiple things on top of what he had within the same year, and it was affecting different ways he was learning. So could I ask for more than one a year?
Absolutely. And, as individuals are developing or as unique pieces emerge, that is something, too, that should be noted either under special alerts if it were an IEP or in the 504 plan, but there's no limit. But you don't want to do it every week because something that changes, you want it to be meaningful. And even if you're waiting for a meeting to happen, you still have the ability to make accommodations or adaptations or to what we like to say, probe something to see if it works. The only time we couldn't do that is when it comes time for college board exams, you have to get the prior approval, or regents or state assessments, you would really have to have that. But everything else, those kind of adjustments can be made at a building level.
Right, and just a quick point on that. I would say any administrator, if you contact them and said, hey, this just happened to my child, they'll put that into place. The 504 and IP just makes it official. So even before, like in mid-February, I think like 2 years ago, my daughter Brooklyn had eye issues, and we just had a meeting like maybe 2 months before. So I just contacted school and I said, hey, this is what's going on, this is what's recommended, what do you think? And they're like, we can put that in place. And then we just reviewed it at an annual meeting.
Right. I had a student who needed a piece of adaptive equipment, and because she was taking biology, all of a sudden they were doing a certain kind of thing that she needed something new, and they did an IEP amendment without a meeting. So a lot of times the parent is informed about it, they're in agreement, the district's in agreement. You don't even need a meeting, they can just send the paperwork over to be signed. So.
Yeah, this is more of a logistics question. Do you start this process with the teacher or with a principal or with the school district, or where does it all begin? And is there a better way to make it happen quickly?
Well, if you have knowledge of someone, I would always be sharing it with the teacher, but also a building level leader. Most districts in New York State, anyway, will have a student support liaison, whether it's the special education and student support office. You can express your concern to multiple people at the same time, so it's on the radar, you know. And I agree, what was shared is getting a meeting early on. There are even preschool supports that could be provided, right? Even early intervention services. Districts can help you navigate the preschool side and the school age aspects. But making the teacher aware, you never want to walk away thinking one person has that knowledge. You kind of want to make sure the building leader and a teacher know, but definitely bring in the teacher, because there are things that they can consider on a day-to-day basis, but don't just rely on knowing that they're going to communicate it to the next level.
Right, so like a simple email, I think, would be if you CC everybody on it, from the teacher to the principal to the CSE chair, is a good place to start.
I'd like to add something, just because I work in a school system. My son is 15 and has APS, but I work, and we chose to send him to a private school, so we don't have any of these issues. But I work in a public school education. I do occupational therapy, and I feel like, just to protect the parents in the room, anytime you communicate, you need to follow up with an email, so you have something in writing to back you up, and it doesn't turn into a he said, she said, or she said this, and then that's not really what the teacher thinks she heard. You know, put it in writing just to protect yourself.
I think that's where the email thing would come in.
Yeah. That, I'm just reiterating what you said, how very important I feel like that is.
Right. And that's why I think she was saying, don't leave it on to one person. Like Dave was saying, teachers the first couple weeks were so inundated with stuff we have to do that it might slip our minds. So that email, I can go back and confirm that when I get home or something, or free time opens up. So.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. I wish you guys were in my school district, because my daughter's school district, I feel, has been just pushing her through for far too long, and now we have an advocate for her. My question to you is, do any of you know, or maybe someone here knows, is there a, the advocate, we just started working with her, she feels that there's a possibility my daughter has a learning disability. In addition, she has an IEP, she's had an IEP since she was 3 because she's blind. Is there a common learning disability among APSED patients that we know of?
I mean, I don't know of that from any data or research, but what I can speak to is it is not atypical for many individuals to have comorbid factors that go on, that take place, that require other levels of intervention. For an IEP service, you're going to have your primary. What is the primary? Whether someone's blind or deaf, a learning disability, that usually carries the label. But the present levels, and that's where Dave was saying before, it wasn't really meaty, it wasn't substantial in nature. It's more about what are those present levels of performance stating with individual strengths as well as individual weaknesses, because it is not atypical. Whether you have ADHD, whatever it might be, there are comorbid variables that often go along with that. So multiple disabilities usually exist.
And is it true that you cannot be tested for a learning disability?
What it is that there's no blood test, there's no test that will yield whether or not someone has a specific learning disability. However, you will know if there are specific learning weaknesses that occur, and by testing performance and by the actual execution of the task that an individual does, you could see where there may be a limitation. And districts don't do MRIs, but barring MRIs and activating certain areas of the brain, I love brain research, I love it, but you could read up on it. Other than that, to see what areas in the brain are firing neurologically, you can't really tell. And you could tell certain areas of the brain that fire or those that don't, but then it becomes, how do you activate that? How do you build that capacity? What I would say to you is, if your child is presenting with a learning weakness in a particular domain, separate from the primary area that is already recognized, take a look at what are the research-based, peer-reviewed interventions being provided to support that skill set. So it shouldn't just be left up to someone's gut, someone's opinion, someone's best practice. There has to be some knowledge base behind the intervention that's being provided. And then you look for meaningful growth. And if meaningful growth isn't taking place, then you go back and you need to be doing something different. Doing the same thing, expecting a different result is silly, you know, but that's what you can do. So no, there's no test for a specific learning disability, but you can identify areas of weakness.
Going off of that, I know when before I was diagnosed, I was getting like D's and failing. So I'm just saying maybe it could also be a this is before I got any calcium, or I remember it was winter and I couldn't remember my teacher's name in the middle of the school year. So I was failing too. So it might be, maybe look at your medication again. Maybe she's lacking certain things to make her fulfill her in school. So.
Well, folks, time's up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to thank our three speakers, Brian, Nancy, and David. I mean, very knowledgeable, very informative, and very helpful, both at understanding level and practical level. So, will you three be around the rest of the conference, or
I will, but
people want to see you?
Brian and I will be around. Nancy.
I have an extended school year summer program going on, and I need to get back to the kids and staff. I apologize.
So, thank our speakers.
Thank you.